Hey guys, Youngblood with you, and today I wanted to give you the first impressions of the RSI Scorpius, which is now on the PTU, with the flyable release and live intended to come with the next patch that's going to bring along Fleet Week. The Scorpius is RSI's answer to the Hurricane, which is a heavy two-man fighter, while not quite matching up to the durability and overall size of the Vanguard line. The overall design of the Scorpius does not disappoint. The Star Citizen equivalent of the X-Wing, or what I kind of see more as the Babylon 5 Star Fury, has a very signature look with foldable wings that expand into an X formation. When you put down your landing gear, the wings will fold back, and the ship almost resembles an Aurora, so there's some design language that's consistent. You can also retract and deploy from the cockpit to control your wings without the requirement of using your landing gear, which is a nice touch, and is something they plan to do for other ships in the game similar to that have wing configurations, and especially important for ships like the Reliant. From an intention perspective, the wings were supposed to be collapsed to minimize the size of the ship, which allows for easier storage, which it does effectively, as it can actually fit into the hangar of an 890 jump, which is great. Currently, the wings, when they are folded back, the guns that are on the wingtip will still fire and shoot through the ship, which clips through the ship, so that's obviously not working as intended. CIG said that there is some work to be done there. There are some thoughts about different configurations that we may see with those wings in the future, but for now, you either have the folded back or deployed in the X formation options. These wings are interesting because they are very large, and that has a few implications and impacts. First off, the size of this ship is 24 meters long, 33 meters wide, and 13 meters tall, but if you look at the ship, it doesn't really appear that big at all. The wings that are long and on those X angles means that you have an oddly large ship without providing a whole lot of function, which means that you have a larger hitbox without a lot of return for that threat. It does provide you with a little bit greater flight model in atmosphere because of the wings. Probably a little too good right now, and CIG intends to adjust that to some degree. But I would say overall the wings are more of a hindrance than a benefit. And then losing one of those in atmosphere obviously has a pretty significant impact on your flight model. Speaking of losing those, I also see the weapons on the wingtips and know that the wings are notorious for getting blown off, and if that happens here, you're going to lose a weapon, which wouldn't happen if those were actually stuck to the body of the ship instead. And finally, speaking of those weapons on the far wingtips, I think there may be some convergence issues of those guns at certain distances, which isn't something that I've run into yet, but I have a hard time believing that that won't be the case. The ship doesn't have a living quarters or interior space like the Vanguard does, so it is closer to the Hurricane in that matter, where you have a seat for the pilot and the gunner. The pilot seat only has 2 MFDs, which frankly is pretty limited at this point, but the expectation is that more information and control will come in the form of a HUD on your helmet, which should be the case for a lot of ships if you choose that. In return, though, you don't have a lot of MFDs that are cluttering your view, and the experience in the cockpit of the Scorpius is pretty fantastic. The glass has seams where the angles converge, but you don't have the signature struts that you have in almost every other RSI ship, so the view is relatively unobstructed. There's also a tent on the glass that gives a unique viewing experience, and it almost looks like a scaled-down version of what I'm hoping the bridge on a Polaris could be. The pilot has control of the 4 wingtip weapons, but if you want to take advantage of the turret, you're going to need to get a gunner in the seat behind the pilot. This seat is interesting because, unlike the Hurricane, this is a remote turret. Now, I like the idea of remote turret as it should be a little safer for the gunner, and especially on the Scorpius, you have the ability to either position it on the top of the ship or sling it on the back underside of the ship. And that would be pretty hard to implement in a manned version of the turret without significantly larger pieces of the pie put together. Once you enter the remote turret mode, you control the rotation, aiming, and firing just like any other turret, but if you would like to move the turret position on the rails, you hit the S key and the turret will slide back to the other location. When that is happening, you lose the ability to fire, and you have a repositioning turret display on your screen, and once that disappears, you can resume firing. Now, I think this ability is nice for a few reasons, such as being more proficient at getting targets off of your tail if you slap the turret on the back, But on a ship like this, I think about the ability of slinging to the rear after you've engaged a target that you're doing a strafing run on could potentially allow for easier firing as you're flying away for greater damage per run. You're attacking on the way in and you're attacking on the way out. Granted, at the speeds we play at in this game and the time it takes for the turret to move, I think you're better off just having the pilot rotate the ship so the gun can still engage without having the downtime of moving the turret, which means in my mind this ends up being a little bit gimmicky to some degree and limited to being used to get a bogey off of your tail more than a functional turret option, and not really a big advantage over the Hurricane's fixed and manned turret. I think we may also see a situation at some point where you can control how far up and back it goes, which may have more value, but that's not implemented now, and I don't know if that's what's going to happen in the future. The exterior of the ship has accessible panels for your components, most of which come down on rails to access at a level that makes working on them in the future more feasible. In addition to components, you have a small storage space and 2 weapons bays for storing long arms and pistols. So once you land and you need to engage in FPS, you and your gunner have access to weaponry. Now, from a weaponry perspective on the ship, you have 16 size 2 missiles, which are kind of in these circular cutouts that are built into the hull, which looks nice and hopefully reduces the signature to some degree. The real threat of the Scorpius, though, is when it's manned with a two-man crew. And the pilot has 4 size 3 hardpoints, which come stock with 2 gimbaled laser repeaters and 4 size 3 repeaters on the turret. Now, if you don't intend to use the pilot guns in gimbal mode, you could run 4 size 3 fixed for a total of 8 size 3 guns, which is pretty wild. In combat, the Scorpius handles itself well and has more than enough firepower to get the job done. When we start talking about components and flight model, this is where I want to really enter the kind of comparison to the Hurricane, so we have that point of reference, especially since we know the Hurricane is already a total monster. For the Scorpius, the component loadout by default is 1 size 2 shield, 2 size 1 power plants, and 2 size 1 coolers. And that actually matched the Hurricane pretty close, with the exception of the Hurricane having the better option with the power plant by having a single size 2 power plant, which granted you lose some redundancy when you take damage, but it outperforms the 2 smaller plants. I was a little surprised to see the Scorpius get the size 2 shielding as well, because my impression was that would have been a Hurricane differentiator, especially with some weaponry that looks like it might favor the Scorpius a little bit, but that didn't pan out as expected. The weaponry is relatively comparable, and I would say one is better suited for the world of today, and the other ship is better off in the future. First off, right now, with weapon stats all being relatively normalized, you don't see that much of a difference in the damage output between the sizes. So the Scorpius having 4 pilot size 3s instead of 2 pilot size 4s means that the Scorpius has better damage output. Both have the same turrets, so if you increase to the max weapon sizes on the hardpoints and you use laser repeaters to normalize the numbers, the Hurricane has a total DPS, pilot, and turret of 1674 versus 1782 on the Scorpius. So the Scorpius is definitely better, but it's not a huge margin. It's only really 100 DPS. Now, if you're opting to run the ship solo, then the difference of 544 versus 652 feels more noticeable from a percentage change, and that favors the Scorpius by a healthy margin. In the future, though, I have faith that the size of weapons will mean more, and the size 4s will outperform or at least be on par with more of the size 3s. Not to mention the most important aspect here, which is going to be the armor penetration of the larger sizes will be important once the armor starts to get implemented on ships, meaning the Hurricane may be the safer bet long term. Where things get a little more interesting is when you start comparing the flight models and the durability and health pools. First off, the intention was that the Scorpius was supposed to be a little slower and a little bit more sluggish than the Hurricane. In typical fashion, the ship was released better than it was sold as, and what we have is the Scorpius having faster SCM speed of 218 versus 198 on the Hurricane, better cruise speed at 1250 versus 1232, and having better yaw, pitch, and roll values. So this ship that was supposed to be slower is actually faster in basically all meaningful ways, including with better maneuverability. And we see the only place that the Hurricane performs better than the Scorpius is with the downward and lateral strafe movements. Things get a little better for the Hurricane when you apply afterburners. The Hurricane is actually capable of performing better than the Scorpius and has better numbers in every direction by a decent margin when you're hitting the afterburner, which means that if you really need it, you have the capacitor charged and you don't mind roasting through some extra fuel. In combat engagements, the Hurricane can outperform a Scorpius in short bursts. Durability, as reviewed via the ship's health pool, is an interesting story, and it's also reflective of the short-term implementation of the game right now. Currently, you have an overall HP of the ship, a body HP, and a nose HP. And if any of those numbers are exceeded, the ship blows up. So, for example, the Hurricane has 18,000 total HP, 7,500 for the nose, 7,500 for the body of the ship. The 18,000 is a larger number than the body and nose combined. Because there are other parts of the ship, like weapons or wings and fins and other things that don't count towards the body or nose, that's why the overall HP ends up exceeding those particular parts. The Hurricane's a pretty tidy and compact ship, so it doesn't have the superfluous things like big wings to worry about. But on the Scorpius, the whole ship is basically wings, so you have a strange thing here. A total HP of 43,000, which is like 2.5 times the Hurricane, and it makes it look oddly durable on paper. In reality, the body has an HP of 6,500, which is less than the Hurricane, and the nose only has 80 HP, which I haven't tested for accuracy or of what is actually considered to be a weak spot, but I would definitely avoid taking that head-on damage and may suggest that you set the shields forward because it may be important to protect that weak spot. That total HP, though, the reason it is so high is because they have more work to do on the damage states. So you need to have a high HP overall to allow for things like the wings, which again, the ship is all wings, to take damage and fall off without causing the ship to be destroyed. So while it is possible to take a ton of damage in the Scorpius by absorbing all of that in the wings, if you're hitting the ship in the body, it's not really all that durable. It does cause a little bit of a balance issue currently because the wings will take fire and the ship will survive longer than it should, but it's a temporary stopgap until that new functionality is put into place. Overall, the Scorpius is a fun ship with a cool design and is pretty damn dangerous based on the damage output, the size 2 shield, and the overall HP. I think long-term, the Hurricane is a better bet and a smaller package that can punch harder with larger weapons, but with the current state weapon statuses being the way they are, you can't really deny the superiority of the Scorpius today. I expect further iterations and tweaks to bring the ship into balance, and the question of being able to man the turrets guns is still to be answered for both of these ships, but would need to be considered very thoroughly based on the implications of doing so. Either way, that's the ship. So hopefully you enjoyed seeing the Scorpius and getting some first impressions. If you have questions, please get them into the comments. Otherwise, stay tuned for a lot more coming soon. Have yourselves a great day and take care.